Welcome to our very first episode of Arctic 360's Breaking the Ice. We are really excited to get this going. My name is Paris.
And my name is Rebecca, and we are your co-hosts. This week, we had the opportunity to speak with Debbie Atuk and Clint Davis about Indigenous Development Corporations. For our listeners who may not know, Indigenous Development Corporations are economic and business development arms of an Indigenous government.
These for-profit community-owned corporations aim to provide financial support to advance community interests. Indigenous Development Corporations play a major role in driving Indigenous economic advancement through business development, employment, and community-based projects.
Debbie is an Inuit, who's the CEO of Kootznoowoo Corporation. Kootznoowoo was born as the result of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971. Debbie's work focuses on helping Alaska Native and Native American communities develop their businesses and improve their economic well-being through prudent investment strategies, strong representation, and advocacy.
Clint, an Inuit from Labrador, served for over 11 years as the chair of board of directors for the Nunasi Group of Companies, which is the economic arm of Nunasi government. Clint Davis, once being the Vice President of Indigenous Banking at TD, is now the President and CEO of Nunasi Corporation.
I think a great way to start is just if you could both tell us a little bit more about your respective corporations and how your corporation sort of differs from maybe what could be perceived as a more traditional corporation or a regular corporation.
Just by way of introduction, my name is Debbie Atuk. I'm originally from Nome, Alaska. I was raised in Nome and Anchorage. My dad is Inuit. It's a group of people from the village of Wales, or Kingagin is how we say it in the Inuit dialect, which I've been studying with my dad for the last couple of years. I have been working in the world of Alaska Native corporations, business development with tribes for the last few years, pretty seriously for the last, 7 or 8 years now. Prior to this, I've worked in finance, I've worked in independent film, and have had work in startups on the East Coast. So last year I was working on a big project for a private equity fund that the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation has instituted. They have begun to do direct investment within the state with a dedicated fund for private equity. And they were looking for an in-state manager, and I worked with a fellow Native American from a tribe down south who has experience with investment advising. We brought in a team that got one of the mandates. They split this mandate into two. So there's $200 million of dedicated funds for private equity investment in the state of the state's money. So it's the first time they've ever done that. That led to me having the opportunity to get a job here in Juneau, where I am now. I work for a corporation called Kootznoowoo. Kootznoowoo is a Tlingit word, and it means Fortress of the Bears. The people of the village of Angoon formed this corporation under the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. And these corporations, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act created over 200 village corporations and 13 regional corporations, which are similar to corporations, any for-profit corporation, in that they are profit-seeking, but they have an inherent social mission, which makes them very different. Their shareholders are they were all originally Alaska Natives. These were corporations that were formed to transfer land and wealth to the Indigenous people of Alaska as a way to, and I quote, extinguish all land claims of the Indigenous people of Alaska. So corporations the state was basically divided up into 13 regions, and then within each region there were village corporations associated, and there are these complicated relationships between these corporations because within a region, a village corporation will have surface rights to their land that they received in transfer, and the regional corporation will have subsurface rights, which can sometimes work together, but sometimes they can become at odds. So not to take things off too far of a tangent, but just to say that Alaska Native corporations have I think, a twofold mission, and that is to be maybe threefold. They're profit seeking. They have to maintain an existence in perpetuity to keep the lands. They're stewards of the lands that were received in INCSA. That's what we call the Land Claims Act. That means that we're always looking for ways to continually innovate. We can't ever let this corporation go under, whichever corporation it is, because they all have land associated with it. And there are accommodations within the Act, actually in the amendments in 1991, for when that might happen. But the goal is to always keep these corporations active and affluent enough, ideally to be paying dividends out to their shareholders, but at the very minimum to always exist to be holders of the land.
Yeah, and we'll circle back to the topic of shareholders, but Clint, if you would like to answer the same question about your corporation and your background and your trajectory.
Sure. So I'm Clint Davis. I'm an Inuk from Labrador. So Labrador is on the east coast of the country. My community connection is to Nunasi, which was the last Inuit land claim to be settled in Canada, and it was settled in 2005. I was born in Goose Bay, which I like to call as the capital of Labrador, which is a town of like 7,000 people. But my dad is from the Inuit community called Rigolet, which is the most southern community of the region. Prior to being the CEO for Nunasi, I was the chair of the Nunasi group of companies, which is an Inuit Development Corporation for Labrador for about 11 years, overseeing our investments in a variety of different industries, ranging anywhere from construction to retail to transportation, marine, as well as fishing and so on. My career has been, even though I'm a lawyer by trade, I went back to school and had a focus on business and the interaction between business and government, as well as with a focus around finance. And so I headed up Indigenous banking for two major financial institutions in Canada. First, the Bank of Montreal, and then secondly, as vice president for Indigenous banking at TD Bank. Sandwiched in between that, I was the CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, which is a nonprofit and essentially a chamber of commerce for Indigenous and non-Indigenous business to come together, collaborate, and identify opportunities to create value. So I've been involved in Indigenous business issues. I've served in the federal government as a senior advisor to two different cabinet ministers. So I have an experience around the public sector, the nonprofit sector. I joined the nonprofit sector in 2008 when our revenues dropped by about 35%, but then also in the private sector, and certainly with a huge focus on Indigenous business. I joined Nunasi about a year ago. In the next couple of days, it'll be a year, just prior to the pandemic. Nunasi is a unique corporate structure for Inuit business and Indigenous businesses and development corporations across the country. Nunasi was established in 1976, so it's the oldest Inuit Dev Corp in Canada. And it was established as a way to create a mechanism to ensure that Inuit would be able to participate economically, financially, entrepreneurially, in activity that was to be expected through the resolution of land claims. But over a period of time, as other Inuit claims started to be settled and respective development corporations started to really grow in financial success and authority, Nunasi started to really take some time and look at what it was all about and to see how it was going to be adding value for its shareholders. And in this case, the Nunasi shareholder was, and we're going through a process now of changing this, but it was the Nunasi Trust. The Nunasi Trust, the beneficiaries of the trust were all Inuit beneficiaries under the Nunavut land claim. So right now, our structure is that we're owned by 3 Inuit regions across Nunavut. We have a board of directors that represents the 3 Inuit regional development corporations. as well as the 3 Inuit regions. So it's a significant voice that's pan-territorial. I've been brought on board to assist in the process to really refocus Nunasi and really provide a laser approach to the industries that's going to participate in to ensure that it is adding value and not crowding out the activity of the other regional dev corps. So we just had a new strategy that was approved by our board in December. And for the next 3 years, that's what we're doing, is building out a team and embarking upon the execution of that strategy. So, Nakumek.
And so both of you guys had mentioned the shareholding structure within both of your corporations. Clint, you also mentioned trustees. And so we were wondering if you guys could elaborate on who are the shareholders specifically in your corporations, and, you know, what is the structure, and if, because there are notions of like birthright shareholders. It's a really unique aspect of Indigenous Development Corps that we want to understand a bit more.
Debbie, go ahead, because you have a very unique structure. Actually, it's intriguing.
Yeah, this is an interesting opportunity to have this conversation. I have to say that I knew zero about these development corps, dev corps, as you call them in Canada. So I'm taking notes. You may have noticed, because I want to make sure that if anything comes up that we're not doing, that I can capture it. So I forgot to mention that I'm actually on the board of directors for the Bering Straits Native Corporation, which is one of the regional corporations. So I serve as the treasurer on that board. I'm on the executive committee, and I'll speak from that perspective. So with that corporation, we have nearly 7,000 shareholders, which is quite a few more than when the corporation was established. When it was first established, everyone was required to have been born on or before December 31st, 1971, right? So there are people like in my family, my youngest brother is not a shareholder. Since then, the act allowed for every corporation to create new classes of shares, as of 1991, and some corporations have done that. I think it's the minority. What's happened is there's been, shares get passed on, and they can also be gifted. So it's not necessarily the case anymore that the shares are 100% owned by Indigenous people, or in our case, Bering Straits is actually a pretty diverse corporation. We have Inupiaq, Yupik, and Siberian Yupik people in our who have traditional lands in our region. So we have at least 3 different major languages and many dialects that are spoken. But our corporation is no longer solely owned by Indigenous people. When somebody who is non-Indigenous receives shares through either through inheritance or through, I don't think you can even gift. I think you can only inherit if you're non-native. And then I believe you're not allowed to vote those shares. So the corporation structure is we're owned by primarily Indigenous people or descendants of Indigenous people. The corporations elect a board of directors, and then management operates most of the corporations. Some of the corporations have become so small, if they didn't have the opportunity to develop, or maybe they did develop and then they've shrunk since then. Some don't actually, there's a few that don't actually operate anymore. But primarily the corporations are run by management, and management reports directly to the board. So in my role at Kootznoowoo, where I'm the president and CEO, I report to the board, and we have quarterly board meetings. So our governance structure is through corporate bylaws, and then any actions that the board takes.
Okay, so do you find that your structure keeps the corporation almost insulated from voices that might, for a lack of better words, like non-Indigenous people having increasing sway or anything like that? No, absolutely not. It's taken 50 years to get the corporations to where they are now. I'm going to generalize, right? So this isn't true for every single case, but in general, these corporations were stood up without any prior experience with capitalism. So it was pretty hit or miss. And the corporations that fared the best were the ones where there were quite a few natural resources that could quickly be exploited. And in that case, let's say in the Southeast where I am right now,
there were already timber, corporations in existence here, and other corporations that existed here. So when corporations were stood up for the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, they could bring in people who had business experience, and so they were afforded the opportunity to quickly start operating. Sometimes that meant hiring people who were non-Indigenous because they happened to have more experience with running corporations. Some of the corporations in other parts of the state hired outside experts, I'll put in air quotes, and didn't do so well and were taken advantage of. Were put into, poor, businesses that weren't a good match for whatever reason. So it's not the case that having a corporation that is 100% owned by Indigenous people means that we have effectively become independent of colonial or settler influence. We borrow heavily. I mean, to this day, right now where I work, we have excellent consultants that we hire and work with who do mean well and do have the best interests of the shareholders. We do a good job of vetting the consultants that we work with, and that's our intention anyway, right? But in the past, it hasn't always been that we've had the best people in the state of Alaska working for the best interests of the shareholders. A lot of times you end up hiring people who say one thing and do another, and their best interests are their own interests.
Thank you so much for clarifying on that. And yeah, Clint, what is the shareholding structure for your corporation?
So historically, we've had a trust, a Nunasi trust. So we had trustees, of which I'm one of them. And there were individuals essentially representing the regions and the interests of their respective citizens or beneficiaries ultimately. So the beneficiaries of the trust were, as I had mentioned before, the beneficiaries of all of the Nunavut land claim. And a trust has a certain lifetime. And so in this particular case, the trust itself was looking at a period of winding down over 21-year time frame of being in existence. And so we're taking advantage of that to make sure that what we're doing is having a much more engaged level of ownership, so that the ownership structure itself better reflects the current corporate governance that we have in place with the other regional development corporations, but yet it's still there for the benefit of all Inuit who are beneficiaries under the Nunavut land claim. Excuse me. So rather than having a trust structure with trusts, and you're following along the lines of, trust rules, accounting requirements for both a trust plus your corporation, different governance, different structure, it just made it very not so efficient or effective, and at the end of the day became quite expensive. However, what we did was we were able to distribute our common shares, which ultimately is your ownership of your company, from our trust to our 3 regional Inuit associations, which are from the east, from the central part of Nunavut, and to the west. Kikitani Inuit Association in the east, Kivalik Inuit Association in central Nunavut, and Kitikmeot Inuit Association in the west. The shares were distributed based upon population, so most going to the east. And from there, it sort of justified why we would actually have the presidents of the Inuit Development Corporations on our board, because they would be speaking on behalf and representing the interests of Nunavummiut, but in particular the Inuit who are beneficiaries under the land claim. I have to say it is rather unique, and everything that I've done in terms of advocacy as well as research around governance is you normally, and even the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, what it would normally do is that it took the position that you'd separate business from politics. And so despite the fact that we actually have presence of 3 political bodies within Nunavut who are on our board, we also have the 3 CEOs of the regional dev corps, which are essentially owned, like each regional dev corp is owned by a regional Inuit association. And we also have the chairs of the board of directors of that. So you have, out of 9 board members, you have 6 who are essentially technicians for the most part, with a deep experience and expertise in business. And we're not to say that we're muting the influence of politics. In fact, the value that our Inuit presidents bring to the board is significant, ensuring that the voice of Inuit are heard, and the dynamics of what's happening in the respective communities and regions come to the forefront for the issues that we're dealing with. So it is a unique structure. We don't have shares that would go to each individual beneficiary, but rather the shares are to the organization, which, as I'd mentioned, represents the interest of Inuit within Nunavut.
Well, that's incredibly interesting. I think, yeah, the relationship between government and business is a very pertinent topic for this, and also the history of the state interacting with these Indigenous communities, as sort of Debbie touched on, is incredibly interesting. And I think there's a lot of sort of historical legacy that definitely we see until today affects our understanding of it. So I appreciate you both, and I'm very grateful that we have two different perspectives from two different geographical locations, so we can learn more about sort of the Canadian approach and the American approach and how that all works out. But Clint, I sort of wanted to ask you more about what you were ending off with there, about does this sort of unique model of Indigenous Development Corporations pose any particular challenges of note?
So I mean, there's logistical challenges, right? So we represent all of Nunavut, and so there's always a challenge for getting people together at times, and we don't have the greatest infrastructure. I mean, these are just issues that I think anybody who represents either a national organization or a pan-territorial organization, they experience. And so it's a big old territory being Nunavut, representing almost 1/3 of Canada's landmass, and 25 communities, right? So the logistics of it can be a bit of a challenge. It's a larger board, so about 9 people on the board. As I'd mentioned, some of the other Dev Corps, usually between 5 to 7 people. So you actually have, arguably you can say it's a little bit more nimble decision making, but to be quite frank, since I've been here and we've had 4 board meetings, I don't think people are really concerned about making a decision. They make the decision and they move on, which is pretty effective. And I don't see the political influence any more than what I see in my role on other boards. So I'm on the board of a chartered bank in Canada, and it's a federally regulated industry. And so we don't necessarily talk big P politics, but we talk about the regulatory environment. We talk about, the relationships we need to forge, the requirements we need to meet, and it's all within the context of public policy and government. And so I find my board does the same sort of thing. No one is, pushing me to hire somebody because they're a brother or whatever. Like, nothing like that happens. My board they're exceptionally professional, sophisticated, and despite the fact 3 of them are politicians, they're very engaged and they understand the technical issues as well too. So other than the real big logistical challenges, I don't see any major challenges or any major problems for governance.
Yeah, thanks for answering. Yeah, I can see how the wide geographical range could definitely pose a difficulty logistically. Debbie, do you have anything that you could add to that?
I think we have slightly different situations. I feel like from listening to Clint, we have a scale. We have a difference in scale.
Yeah.
Is that right, Clint?
Yeah.
You're like 100,000 you're dealing with.
Yeah.
And at the most, in my experience with Bering Straits, we don't even have 10,000 yet that we're dealing with. So
10,000 members, you mean, or?
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. So no, we're not 100,000, so it's more like 36,000, but
quite a bit bigger. So in theory, right now in investment circles, one of the big topics, and this comes up from time to time, it's not new, but the ESG, right? So in theory, we have 50 years of experience of these for-profit corporations that are, by their nature, those are very important. The protecting the environment, because these are our homelands. Any development that happens there, we need to minimize the impact or have no impact on traditional subsistence living. So that has put us in conflict with some of our greatest opportunities here. So in some ways, I think that the people in the Arctic Slope region of Alaska have been a very good example of being good stewards for doing they were very thoughtful in getting involved with development. They have benefited economically, but they have not given up their traditional and subsistence food gathering, their hunting and gathering. They have a very active whale hunting season still. They have been impacted by the development that they chose to participate in. They do both. They have development and they still continue to practice whale hunting. They do have the benefit of using more modern methods so that they can go further and further afield as the environment changes, climate changes happen. They have to travel further out. So technology is helping them with being able to pursue that. But I feel like we should be the very model of ESG. Whether or not we are, that remains to be seen. I do think the Arctic Slope region is a good example of being able to have do development that is extractive and to still maintain healthy animal populations that we depend on for our food sources. The caribou migration happens year in, year out. I worked in the Prudhoe Bay oil fields in the 90s for about 3.5 years. I saw it with my own eyes. The development there has been very, very responsible. And it's, I think, thanks in no small part to the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation and the village corporations there, like Utqiagvik. I think the village corporations, in particular, they work really, really closely with the community.
So what could you say about how this model could work for other for-profits more generally?
I think the activism, having a sense of ownership, that's something that I would like to see happen in larger society. So for instance, when there were some protests going on around the Dakota Access Pipeline. So I'm neither for or against the Dakota Access Pipeline. It's not in my area. I don't like to take stands on other people's traditional lands. I respect their choices. That was a choice that the people there made, right? And when people started piling on and getting behind that issue of being against it and trying to impact it, one of the things that I would say is you as a shareholder have responsibilities. I feel that as a shareholder in my village native corporation, which is the Village Native Corporation of Nome, it's called Sitnasak, and as a shareholder of Bering Straits Native Corporation, I feel that because we make a decision in what businesses we get into, and there are consequences. And one of the things that has happened in the U.S. Model of trading and being shareholders, and if you're in the US and you're listening to this and you have any money in a 401k plan or in a pension fund, you probably have shares in corporations like large banks who may be taking actions around the world that you may not be aware of. And so one of the things that you can do if you want to be a thoughtful member of how our society operates and impacts the planet and Indigenous people or the environment or climate or animals is to really pay close attention to what funds your money is in. Because even if you only have a little bit of money in a fund, in the aggregate, you're part of a very important part of what is driving everything that's happening in investments globally. We collectively, we have, we fund and we drive what people like Fidelity is investing in. And people, I think, need to be more thoughtful about that, not to just go, oh, it's that time of year. And I'll speak for someone who, I don't have a 401k program where I work now, but I have been in this situation in the past. Oh, it's that time of year again. I just fill out this 401k program. I don't know where my money is. What does it have to do with me? Well, what does it have to do with wherever those corporations, those large corporations, do you have money in extractive, corporations that are doing extractive mineral resource development? Are you for or against that? If you're against that, then make a decision and be more thoughtful about where your money is invested.
You mentioned the relationship that we have with like financial institutions, and so I wanted to direct this question to Clint. Having been in that world, we've been having conversations, and we're learning that financial institutions are boycotting the Arctic within the context of ESGs. and what they're doing are using ESGs as a way of justifying or like morally explaining the reasons why they're removing investments from the Arctic. And so we were wondering if you had a more personal or more like intimate understanding of the situation, and if this is the case.
So I think some of these international financial institutions primarily view the Arctic as a park. I think they view the Arctic as a place where nobody lives. And if they do, that we're so primitive that we've been surviving off the land for thousands of years. So why would you want to be interested in any development that would happen within those regions? I think it's a very short-sighted view. I think it's a view that is driven more by social media platforms and popularity, as opposed to really taking the time to understand what that region is, who lives there, what the goals and aspirations of the region are, and how much of an asset that region is to the entire planet. It's very simple for somebody in Frankfurt to say that we're not going to do any drilling in the Arctic and we're going to divest all of our holdings of any company that is doing drilling or any kind of extractive activity within that region. When they have broadband, they have reliable energy, they have reliable heat, they have food security. It's very simple for all of them to be able to do that when in fact, as Debbie had mentioned, our companies and my company have been around since the 70s, and all the other regional DevCorps have been around, and other Inuit DevCorps have been around since the early 80s to mid 80s. I think we personify those companies that represent the best of the best around ESG. We're not perfect, we're people, we make mistakes. We made investments in some businesses that, you know, it wasn't the greatest when it came to, you know, greenhouse gas emissions, or, you know, we're involved in mining, which can have some challenges at times. But at the end of the day, our companies are set up in a way where we have to operate in a manner that provides remarkable respect for the environment, because our beneficiaries and our managers, our board directors, they're out on the land whenever they have the time. Just a funny anecdote, this past pandemic year, obviously in Nunavut, very few people traveled south. Certainly nobody on my board of directors who are domiciled in the far north traveled south. And they thought it was the most wonderful summer that they had, because they had a chance to get out on the land and every moment they had with their families. And so they weren't stuck on a plane flying to Edmonton or going to Toronto or going to Ottawa. And so the environment is synonymous with the work that we do, and is synonymous in many respects to the identity of an Indigenous person. Social. So the one thing that I find frustrating, and I do get nervous that ESG is going to be not necessarily a flash in the pan, but it's an articulation now that is becoming popular. And companies are actually saying, oh, we've been doing ESG all along, when in fact, I think if you start to peel the onion, you'll see that there's a different narrative there. For Debbie's corporation, for my corporation, for the corporation I served on the board for, as I said, environment is critical. Our interest as Indigenous people, as Inuit, extends beyond the S of ESG. It's not just social, although social is a critical part of it in terms of the health and welfare of our communities. But there's also governance, issues around governance. Debbie had talked about it. Like, I mean, making sure that you recognize the responsibility that you have. I would say as a board member, as a trustee, and ultimately as a shareholder. And so that you have that responsibility to communicate and to direct, either directly or indirectly, the strategy of a corporation and where it's going to start to focus its energy. I would extend that as well. And I'd like to have Debbie chime in on this as well. In terms of the capital that many Indigenous communities, regions, organizations, usually political bodies, have been able to accumulate over the last 40 years. So by my calculation, which is probably conservative, Indigenous communities, and these are Inuit across the country, as well as First Nations and Métis in Canada, collectively, through the resolution of land claims, through economic activity, through other types of partnerships and relationships they would have with government, they would have in excess of about $13 to $14 billion of capital. So think about that, $13 to $14 billion of capital are now invested in the open market, and they're governed predominantly by a trust structure on how that money is being managed. In fact, Nunasi, we're going through our own process. We're not governed by a trust, but rather we're going to be governing our investment activity through an investment policy statement. And so many, it's starting to change, but in the past, so many trustees, so many communities, so many regions were far removed as to where that money was being invested. And we're starting to see a bit more activity as a result of different efforts by national Indigenous organizations to bring awareness to trustees and community members who have that responsibility as to where their hard-earned capital, it's their sovereign wealth fund essentially, is being invested. And we're seeing some communities start to raise concern over investments in companies that do bottled water, pipelines, exploitation of the forestry, and so on, right? And so actually starting to see a much more methodical and systematic approach to influencing how that money is being invested. You still want to have that separation to ensure that your investment manager can do this and do it in a way that's independent, but he or she will have to be guided by the values of the community. And based upon some of the work I've done with the banks and with other Indigenous communities, it's unfortunately, you see that misalignment at times between the values of the community and where that capital is being invested. And you see that sometimes as well with development corporations and the activity that they're engaged in as well. So I support 100% what Debbie had talked about, particularly around ESG, how ESG is now this new thing. We've been doing it for decades, right? It's a part of who we are. When I grew up and went to do my undergrad in business, the purpose of the corporation was the maximization of shareholder wealth. And that, while we do want to generate returns to our shareholders for Nunasi, I'd like to say that we're generating responsible returns to ensure that we understand what the values of the community are and how we do this in a way that's responsible and prudent.
Yeah, I think it is interesting sort of how, at least I've been noticing the use of ESG, CSR, definitely sort of seen as buzzwords used by a lot of companies, and sort of with the expectation that maybe people won't be actually researching to see what the company is actually doing or anything like that. So it's really interesting to see how your corporation sort of actually do align with these initiatives. And you've obviously demonstrated that today. Thank you again for taking the hour to help us, because I know both of your time is incredibly valuable, and we really appreciate hearing directly from you.
To wrap everything up, we want to know if anybody walked up to you on the street and asked you what the most pressing issue in the Arctic is, what would you say?
I mean, I think that we're a little behind the Canadian infrastructure when it comes to high-speed internet. But right now, the most pressing thing is, even though we have a few communities still that don't have running water, I would put keeping pace with technology, giving communities high-speed internet so that students can keep up.
I would say the same thing. I think it's the investment, certainly what we see in Nunavut and other parts of Inuit Nunaat, which is the Inuit homeland in Canada. It's just that lack of basic investment in infrastructure, right? So you still have so many communities on boil water advisories. So if you don't have clean water, you're not healthy. If you don't have housing, you're not healthy. If you don't have internet, it's a barrier to entrepreneurialism, education, telehealth, the ability to run your government. Like you need that. It's difficult to conceptualize how one region of the world is dark, and it's the Arctic, right?
This has been so interesting. Thank you so much to you both for working with us in our schedules so that we could meet and talk. I would have never had such an interesting conversation. I would have never known so much as I do know now, which I feel like I just scratched the surface, but I look forward to maybe we can do more together in between Canada and Alaska on this topic.